Okay, we're going to go to this picture first. And before we get started, you need to fix some of the numbering because the copier probably chopped it off. So here is 1, and then up here, this arrow is number 2, and this arrow is number 3. So just fix it there. If I were you, I would write the answers over here. Because when you're studying, you can look over here and say, okay, number 7, what is that? Oh yeah, parietal occipital sulcus. And then you can check yourself over here. You can cover this up and check yourself. I am going to write them, gosh, I don't know. I'll probably write them over here because then I don't have to slide back and forth and you can see everything at one time. But if I were you, I'd write everything in the box. Just so for studying purposes. Okay, on this picture what we're looking at is the brain, and what I want you to first label is that this is the front or more anterior part of the brain, whereas this is the back of the brain or posterior. So make sure you know front and back when you're looking at the picture. Okay, this front lobe here, number 1, is talking about the front of the head, the front lobe of the brain. And if you remember, your frontal lobe is in the front. So this is the actual frontal lobe of the brain. And I'm just going to outline it to save time. Be careful not to go over on number 2. So I just outlined here the frontal lobe. You can go in and color it later with a colored pencil if you want, but for right now, just label it and outline it. Okay, that's the frontal lobe of the brain. Number 3, and we'll skip 2 for right now. Number 3 is talking about a big groove that runs in the brain. And if you remember from the basic brain notes, a groove is called a sulcus. And number 3 is going to be the central sulcus. Okay, and I might actually have to write it over here in the box. So number 3 is the central sulcus. It is not a bump, it's a groove. There are 2 bumps that lie on the anterior and posterior portions of that central sulcus. If it comes before the central sulcus, our prefix for before is pre. So number 2 would be the pre-central, and since it is a bump, not a groove, it's called a gyrus. Then number 4 comes after the central sulcus. Our prefix for after is post. So that is the post central. And since it is a bump, not a groove, it's called a gyrus. Okay, and I will outline those 2. So number 2 here is the precentral sulcus, precentral gyrus, and number 4 is the post-central gyrus. Okay, and I could kind of color those in. You can see. Just like that. Okay. Number 5 is another lobe, and that's going to be the parietal lobe of the brain. Just like the parietal bones right there, so that makes that the parietal lobe. And I will outline it. Okay, there's your parietal lobe. Number 6 is a sulcus, so it is a groove that runs laterally through the brain. So it is called the lateral, and since it is a groove, not a bump, we're going to call it a sulcus. So it's like these lines here that you can kind of see in your copy are the sulci. Okay, number 7 is the sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And so all you're going to do is smush those words together. And you're going to get parieto, I'm going to put a dash in between it, occipital, and it is a groove, not a bump, so we'll call it a sulcus. Parieto occipital sulcus. Number 8 is the occipital lobe. Right where your occipital region and your occipital bone is. So number 8 is the occipital lobe of the brain. Okay, pretty easy. Number 9 is this more wrinkled area underneath the brain, more posterior of the brain, posterior part of the brain, and that is going to be called your cerebellum. Be careful, it's not your cerebrum, it is your cerebellum. And I'm just going to kind of shade it in yellow. Your cerebellum. Number 10, I'm going to go to 10, then I'm going to do 11, 12, 13. Number 10 is your temporal lobe of the brain. And I'm just going to leave it that dark color because I can't color over it. That's your temporal lobe, right where your temporal bone is. 11, 12, 13 is the brain stem. Collectively, they're the brain stem, but it's split into 3 parts. And it's really easy to remember the 3 parts because the acronym is PMS. Now, 11 is P, 12 is M, 13 is S. And that stands for, 11 is called the pons, P-O-N-S. 12 is your medulla oblongata, M-E-D-U-L-L-A, O-B-L-O-N-G-A-T-A. And 13 is your spinal cord. Just the beginning part of it. And it will extend all the way through your vertebral column. But you can remember it, PMS, pretty easy. Pons, medulla oblongata, and spinal cord. Okay, 15, 16, 17 down here is just like if I take this chunk right here out of the brain and I put it right here. You can see a cross section of what does the brain look like if I'm going from superficial to deep. On the outside most part of the brain, you can see there are bumps and you can see there are grooves. 15 is referring to the whole bump here. And the bumps on the brain are called gyri, or one is called a gyrus. 16 is the cortex. Okay, and that's gray matter, if you remember from the last video. 17 is white matter, and we're going to call it the internal area. It is white matter, whereas the cortex is gray. If you see here, we get areas where that gray matter will be more shallow, and then areas where that gray matter is deeper. Number 18 is just referring to one of the grooves of the brain. And the grooves of the brain are called sulci. One is called a sulcus. And then when that gray matter extends deeper into the white matter, and this is actually number 14. Fix your number there. It got chopped off too. But 14 is called a fissure, which is deep gray matter. When that gray matter from the cortex just extends deeper into the white matter. Alright, that's about it for this picture. I'm going to do another video on the picture on the back, and we don't need any colors for it. Okay. Alright, so flip over and then go to the next video.